was another rainy night at Burger Shack, the kind where the rain hit the window so hard it felt like the building might cave in. I was 17 and stuck delivering burgers to people who couldn't care less about the guy getting soaked to bring them their cold fries. The place itself was a dump with flickering lights and a smell of grease that clung to your clothes no matter how much you washed them. Mr. Cobb, the manager, barked orders from behind the counter like we were soldiers in some burger war. "Nathan, got a big tip for you tonight," he said, waving a receipt in my face. "Thornwood Street. Don't screw it up." Thornwood Street. Even the name sounded creepy. It wasn't on our usual delivery route, and I'd never been there before. "Isn't that out of bounds?" I asked. "Big tip," he repeated, as if that was all that mattered. "Take it or clock out." So I grabbed the bag, threw on my jacket, and headed out into the rain. The roads were dark, barely lit by my old Honda's dim headlights. The GPS kept losing signal, and every turn seemed to lead me deeper into nowhere. By the time I found Thornwood Street, the rain had turned into a relentless downpour. The house was the last one on the street, a crumbling Victorian-style place with a sagging roof and windows that seemed to watch you. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the yard. I pulled up and killed the engine, my gut already telling me this was a bad idea. The front door was wide open, not cracked, not ajar, wide open. I hesitated, rain dripping off my hood as I held the bag of food. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small against the rain. "Come in. Kitchen's straight ahead," a voice answered from inside. It was cheerful, but something about it felt wrong. Too perfect, like someone trying too hard to sound normal. I stepped inside, shaking off the rain. The house smelled stale, like it hadn't been lived in for years. The kitchen light was on, and the room itself was spotless, a sharp contrast to the dilapidated exterior. I set the bag down on the counter and turned to leave. "Nathan," the voice called again. This time, it came from deeper inside the house, from a hallway shrouded in darkness. "Could you bring it here?" My stomach churned. How did they know my name? It wasn't on the receipt, was it? My hands clenched into fists, and every instinct I had screamed at me to leave. "Sorry, I gotta go," I said, backing toward the door. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I bolted, slamming the door behind me, and ran to my car. The engine sputtered, the tires skidded in the mud, but I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hallway, heard that voice calling my name. At work the next day, I debated telling Mr. Cobb, but what could I say? "Hey boss, your delivery spot might be haunted." He'd laugh me out of the place. The next few shifts were normal enough. No strange orders, no creepy houses. But the memory of Thornwood lingered, clawing at the back of my mind. I started having nightmares, dark hallways, voices whispering my name, shadowy figures watching me from windows. Then, about a week later, the phone rang just as I was about to clock out. Mr. Cobb picked it up, nodded, and handed me a receipt. "Thornwood Street, again." "No way," I said, shaking my head. "You scared, kid?" He smirked. "Big tip, don't be a baby." Reluctantly, I grabbed the bag and headed out. This time, I wasn't just nervous. I was terrified. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The house looked the same, dark, decrepit, and unwelcoming. The front door was open again, the porch light flickering. I parked farther away this time, hoping to get a better look before going in. But as I stepped onto the porch, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the cold, it was the feeling of being watched. "Come in," the voice called, just like before. This time it was sharper, almost impatient. I stepped inside, heart pounding. The kitchen was the same, spotless, silent, unsettling. I set the bag down and froze. There on the counter was the bag from my first delivery, untouched. "Nathan," the voice called again from the same dark hallway. But now it sounded different, hollow, mechanical. I turned and ran, not even bothering to shut the door behind me. My car started on the first try and I sped away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. But as I drove, I glanced at the receipt. The name on it wasn't one I recognized. It was mine. Back at work, I couldn't focus. I needed answers. Who was ordering from Thornwood? Why was my name on that receipt? During my next day off, I headed to the library to dig into the town's history. It didn't take long to find something. Carter family disappearance. Read an old newspaper headline. The article detailed how a family of 4 had vanished from Thornwood Street years ago. The house had been empty ever since, passed between owners who never stayed long. There were rumors of strange occurrences, lights turning on by themselves, voices heard at night. But the part that chilled me to the bone was a detail buried at the end of the article. The youngest Carter, a boy named Nathan, had been last seen near the kitchen, holding a delivery receipt. I don't know why I went back. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe I just needed closure. But a week later, I found myself driving to Thornwood one last time. This time I brought a flashlight and a friend's baseball bat. Not that I thought it would help. The house was darker than ever. The porch light out, the doors still open. I stepped inside, gripping the bat tightly. The kitchen was cold, colder than it should have been. The clock on the wall was stopped at 3:33. Again. "Nathan," the voice called. Softer this time, almost pleading. "Come to the hall." I hesitated, then moved toward the hallway. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. The walls were lined with pictures, old and faded. Most were of the Carter family, parents smiling, kids playing. But at the end of the hall, the pictures changed. They showed me, delivering food, standing on the porch, running to my car. My stomach turned. I swung the flashlight toward the end of the hall where a door stood slightly ajar. Light spilled out from the cracks. I pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a chair and a mirror on the wall. As I stepped closer, my reflection shifted. It wasn't me anymore. It was a boy about 10 years old staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Help us," he whispered, his voice overlapping with the familiar one from the house. The door slammed shut and the light went out. I dropped the bat and ran, smashing through the front door and sprinting to my car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I quit my job the next day. I told Mr. Cobb the truth, but he just laughed and called me crazy. Maybe I am. Maybe it's all in my head. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. A whisper. "Come back, Nathan." And I know deep down that one day I might have to. Working the night shift wasn't exactly on my bucket list, but I needed the money. It was supposed to be a quiet shift at Grocer Max, a 24-hour market on the edge of our small town. My co-worker, Jake, had called out sick, and my boss practically begged me to fill in. I figured, why not? The night shifts were usually uneventful, mostly truckers grabbing coffee and insomniacs picking up random snacks. It was just after 11 p.m. when I started my shift. The store was eerily quiet, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the aisles. It was colder than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the place felt off. By midnight, I was knee-deep in stocking canned goods when I heard footsteps echo through the store. Not the hurried pace of a shopper grabbing something and leaving, but slow, deliberate steps. "Hello?" I called out, stepping into the main aisle. No response. I glanced toward the frozen section and saw him. A man, tall and thin, with messy hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He stood perfectly still, staring into the freezer, like he was lost in thought. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing a polite tone. He turned his head slowly, his face breaking into a wide, unsettling grin. "Do you have any almond milk? Unsweetened? Vanilla?" Yeah, aisle 3, I said, pointing. But he didn't move. Instead, he kept looking at me, his grin never fading. "Do you work here alone?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. "No," I lied. My manager's in the back. He chuckled softly, almost as if he didn't believe me. That's good. Nights like these, it's better not to be alone. I walked away, my heart pounding. Something about him wasn't right. Back in the stockroom, I tried to shake off the encounter. The hum of the industrial freezers in the background did little to calm my nerves. I grabbed a box of chips and headed back out, only to find the man again, this time in the produce section. He wasn't shopping. He was watching me. I kept my head down and stocked the shelves as quickly as I could, but I could feel his gaze. Every time I glanced up, he'd look away, pretending to inspect an apple or adjust his coat. A loud crash broke the silence. I spun around to see a display of cereal boxes toppled over. The man stood at the end of the aisle, smiling. "Sorry," he said. "Guess I'm a little clumsy tonight." "It's fine," I muttered, bending down to clean up the mess. But then he stepped closer, reaching out to place a hand on my shoulder. His grip was cold and firm. "You seem nervous," he said, tilting his head. "Don't worry. I'm harmless." I jerked away, mumbling something about needing to check the back. My hands were shaking as I retreated to the stockroom, locking the door behind me. I needed a minute to calm down, so I went to the employee restroom. Splashing cold water on my face, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to convince myself it was just some weirdo and not a real threat. Then I heard it, the faint creak of the restroom door opening. "Who's there?" I called out, grabbing the box cutter from my pocket. The door opened slightly, just enough for me to see a single eye peering through the gap. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice trembling. The eye disappeared, and the door slammed shut. I didn't wait. I ran out of the restroom, scanning the store for any sign of him. The aisles were empty, but I felt like I was being watched. I made my way to the manager's office, locking the door behind me. The security monitors flickered, showing empty aisles and the parking lot outside. But then, on one of the screens, I saw him. He was standing in the parking lot under the flickering streetlight, staring directly at the camera. His grin was wider now, almost unnatural. The sound of my phone ringing startled me. It was my boss. "Ethan, what's going on? You sound panicked," he said. "There's a guy here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He's not normal. He followed me to the bathroom and now he's outside, just staring." "Call the cops," he said firmly. I hung up and dialed 911, explaining the situation as best as I could. The operator assured me that officers were on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I kept watching the monitors, waiting for the police, when I noticed something horrifying. The man wasn't alone anymore. 2 other figures had joined him, standing perfectly still under the streetlight. When the police arrived, I bolted out of the office to meet them. But by the time we reached the parking lot, the men were gone. The officers took my statement, but their skepticism was obvious. They checked the security footage, only to find static during the times I said I saw the man. "You sure you're not just imagining things?" one of them asked. "I'm not crazy," I snapped. "I saw them." They left without much more than a pat on the back and a promise to check the area. I felt like they didn't believe me. I avoided night shifts after that, but the incident stayed with me. A week later, I found a note taped to my car window in the store parking lot. It read, "You're not alone." Now, every time I'm alone, I feel like I'm being watched. Every shadow, every creak, it all reminds me of that night. Sometimes I dream about the man under the streetlight. Only now, he's closer. Working nights at the gas station was supposed to be easy. No bosses, no rush hours, just a quiet little store on the edge of town. I'd sit behind the counter, scroll through my phone, and wait for the clock to hit sunrise. That was the plan anyway. The station sat at the end of a lonely road, surrounded by trees and nothing else. The only noise came from crickets and the occasional hum of a passing truck. Peaceful, right? That night, though, the quiet felt heavier, like the air itself was watching me. I was restocking the chip aisle when the radio buzzed with static before cutting to a breaking news alert. Some guy had gone missing near the highway, last seen late at night walking alone. Great, I muttered, turning the volume down. The last thing I needed was a creepy story getting in my head. Then I saw it. Movement outside the window. Just a flicker of shadow by the pumps. I froze, staring into the dark parking lot. Probably just a deer, I told myself, shaking it off. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder as I worked. The bell above the door chimed, and I nearly dropped the box of chips. A man walked in. He was tall, hunched, with a filthy gray jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. His hood was up and his face was hidden in shadows. "Evening," I called out, forcing a smile. He didn't respond, just shuffled toward the back of the store. I watched him as he wandered the aisles, mumbling something under his breath. His hands stayed shoved deep in his pockets, and he didn't look at a single product. "You need help finding something?" I asked, stepping out from behind the counter. He stopped dead in his tracks, facing the freezers. Slowly, he turned his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. Pale, sunken cheeks, dark eyes that didn't blink. His lips moved like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, he walked to the counter and stood there, staring at the security monitor above me. I followed his gaze. The screen showed the empty parking lot, the aisles, the man himself. But something was wrong. His reflection on the monitor wasn't moving. "You all right, man?" I asked, my voice shaky. He leaned closer, his breath fogging up the glass countertop. "He's watching," he whispered. I blinked. "Who's watching?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out the door without buying anything. The bell chimed softly as the door closed behind him. I let out a shaky breath and checked the security footage. But when I rewound the tape to watch him leave, he wasn't there. It was like he'd never entered the store at all. The rest of the shift dragged on. I couldn't stop thinking about the guy in the gray jacket. His words echoed in my head. "He's watching." Around 2 a.m., the phone behind the counter rang. It startled me so much I knocked over my coffee. Wiping my hands on my jeans, I picked up the receiver. 7-Eleven, this is Ethan. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, I heard a low, garbled sound. It wasn't a voice. It was more like a mix of breathing and growling, layered over with faint whispers. "Hello? Who is this?" I asked, my heart racing. The sound shifted into a sharp, high-pitched screech. I yanked the phone away from my ear, slamming it back onto the receiver. But the noise didn't stop. It echoed in the air, faint and distant, like it was coming from somewhere inside the store. I grabbed the flashlight and headed to the back room where the noise seemed loudest. The storage room was empty, just shelves of supplies and the smell of dust. But on the floor, scratched into the concrete, were 3 words. "He's watching you." I didn't know whether to call the police or just quit on the spot. Before I could decide, the bell chimed again. I turned, and there he was, the man in the gray jacket. His hood was down this time, and his hair was plastered to his head like he'd been caught in a storm. But it hadn't rained all night. He stood in the doorway, water dripping onto the tile floor, staring at me with those same hollow eyes. My chest tightened as he stepped inside, his boots squelching with every step. He stopped by the freezer aisle again, his gaze fixed on the glass. But this time he didn't just stare. He pressed his hand against the door. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw it. His reflection in the glass didn't match his movements. While he stood still, the reflection turned its head to look at me, and it smiled. "Hey," I shouted, my voice breaking. "You need to leave." He let out a low, guttural growl and turned toward the door. But instead of opening it, he walked right through it. The bell didn't chime, and when I checked the cameras, he wasn't there. By the time my shift ended, I was a mess. I drove home with the windows rolled up, locking the doors as soon as I got inside. I tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump. Around 3 a.m., the phone rang. Not my cell, the house phone. I hesitated before picking it up. "Hello?" Static, followed by the same growling whispers I'd heard at the store. I slammed the phone down, but the noise didn't stop. It was coming from inside the house. I followed the sound to the living room where I found a puddle of water on the coffee table, and next to it, neatly folded, was the gray jacket. I couldn't stay there. Grabbing a flashlight, I searched the house for any sign of him. The basement was the last place I checked. It smelled damp, and the walls were lined with old cobwebs. I shone the flashlight around and my stomach dropped. The walls were covered in writing. "He's watching you." Scattered on the floor were papers, receipts from the gas station, photos of me taken from inside my house. In the corner, a pile of rusty knives gleamed faintly in the light. Then I heard the tapping. It came from the small basement window. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward it. He was there, the man in the gray jacket smiling at me through the glass. I ran upstairs, locked every door, and called the police. By the time they arrived, the basement was empty. No writing, no photos, no knives. They didn't believe me. That night, I checked old news archives. The man in the gray jacket had worked at the gas station years ago. He'd vanished one night, leaving behind a cryptic note. "He's watching. Don't let him choose you." I thought I could escape, but the messages kept coming. Photos of me, taken through windows with the caption, "He's watching." I drove back to the gas station, desperate for answers. He was waiting for me. "You stayed too long," he said. "Now it's your turn." The lights flickered and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was alone in the store, but at home, waiting on my doorstep, was a package. Inside was the gray jacket, with a note stitched inside. "He's always watching." I don't know what happens next, but I feel it. His eyes on me, waiting for me to pass it on. I've always hated working the night shift at the Quick Mart. It's not that I'm scared of the dark or anything, it's just the isolation. The store is right off a back road in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and woods. At night, it feels like I'm the only person for miles. Most nights are quiet, which is worse in a way. The silence gets to you. It was late December, and the snowstorm had hit harder than anyone expected. My coworker Danny called in sick, so I was stuck covering the whole shift by myself. Great. I clocked in around 11 p.m., stocked some shelves, and tried not to think about how dead quiet it was outside. By midnight, the roads were completely buried. No cars, no people. Just me, the hum of the refrigerators, and the occasional creak of the old shelves. I tried to focus on my work, stacking bags of chips in aisle 3, but every sound felt amplified. The wind against the glass doors, the groan of the heater kicking in, it all made my nerves jump. Then I heard it. A loud thud from the back of the store. I froze. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. Probably just a shelf giving out, I thought. Still, I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and made my way toward the sound. The storage room door was slightly ajar, swinging in the draft from the heater. I pushed it open and scanned the room. Nothing. Just boxes of inventory and a tipped-over broom. I put the broom back, turned around, and nearly jumped out of my skin when the automatic door whooshed open behind me. A man stepped inside, snowflakes clinging to his long, dark coat. He was tall, thin, and had this look about him that I couldn't place. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp, and his eyes seemed sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. Something about him felt wrong. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer, just stood there staring at me for a moment before finally asking, "Cigarettes?" "They're behind the counter," I said, gesturing. "What brand?" "Marlboro," he muttered, barely looking at me. I handed him the pack, and he lingered at the counter, fiddling with it. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and he asked, "You here all by yourself?" My stomach dropped, but I forced a laugh. "Nah, someone's in the back." He smiled, just a little too wide, and left without another word. I watched him walk out into the snow and disappear into the night. The automatic door slid shut behind him, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief. But something gnawed at me. He'd left without lighting the cigarette he seemed so eager to buy. Shaking it off, I went back to work. I was in the cooler restocking drinks when I heard another noise, this time a faint scratching sound. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. It was coming from the storage room again. Gripping the flashlight, I headed back there. The door was closed now, which was weird because I'd left it open. I pushed it open and shined the light around the room. Nothing. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something chilling. Wet footprints leading from the back door into the store. The back door was supposed to be locked. I checked it earlier. My heart pounded as I followed the footprints. They led out of the storage room and into the main aisle. I turned the corner, and there he was. The same guy standing at the end of the aisle, staring at me. "Hey," I called, my voice cracking. "What are you doing back here?" He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. Then he smiled again, that same unsettling grin. I bolted for the counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. The line was dead. No dial tone. Nothing. Panic surged through me. I looked up, and the man was gone. The snow outside was coming down harder now, blanketing the parking lot. I couldn't see his footprints anymore. But then I noticed something else. Shadows moving near the windows. The power flickered, and the store went dark for a few seconds. When the lights came back on, the man was standing right outside the glass doors, staring in at me. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the counter and shouted, "Leave, or I'm calling the cops." My voice was shaking, and I knew he could hear the fear in it. He didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted again, his eyes fixed on me. Then he raised one hand and pointed at the lock on the door. "No way," I muttered. I backed up, my hand fumbling for my phone. No service. Of course. I crouched behind the counter, trying to think of what to do. That's when I heard the back door slam. I ran to the storage room, bat in hand, but it was empty. The door was wide open, the snowstorm raging outside. I shut it and locked it, but when I turned around, he was there, standing at the end of the storage room, dragging a metal pipe across the concrete floor. "You don't belong here," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "What do you want?" I shouted, raising the bat. He didn't answer. He just started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. I swung the bat as hard as I could, but he sidestepped it with ease. Before I could swing again, he lunged, grabbing the bat and wrenching it from my hands. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of boxes. "Stay away!" I screamed, kicking at him. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it in his face, and for the first time I saw it clearly. His eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. I scrambled to my feet and threw the flashlight at him. It hit him square in the chest, giving me just enough time to bolt past him and out of the storage room. I ran through the store, out the back door, and into the blizzard. The freezing wind cut through me like a knife, but I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, finally collapsing in the snow by the side of the highway. A passing car stopped, and the driver called the police. When the cops arrived, I told them everything. They searched the store, but didn't find anyone. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just an empty store. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't go back there, not after what happened. Sometimes when I drive past the old Quick Mart, I swear I see someone standing in the window, watching, waiting. But I don't stop. I just keep driving.